Imagine waking up in a quiet medieval town where the streets smell of bread, smoke, and livestock. But within weeks, that same town would become a place of terror, silence, and death. Doors sealed, church bells ringing endlessly, carts rolling through empty streets, carrying the bodies of neighbors, friends, and entire families. In the middle of the 14th century, something invisible arrived in Europe, something so deadly, so mysterious, that people believed it was the end of the world. This nightmare became known as the Black Death, and it would wipe out nearly half of Europe's population. But the true story of the plague is even darker than most people realize. Behind the statistics are terrifying secrets, strange beliefs, shocking human behavior, and mysteries that still haunt historians today. What really caused this catastrophe? How did entire cities collapse in weeks? And what desperate choices did people make when survival seemed impossible? The deeper you look into the medieval plague, the more disturbing the truth becomes. The story begins far from Europe, deep in the trade networks of Asia. Long before the plague devastated medieval towns, it traveled silently along the massive trade routes connecting continents. One of the most important was the Silk Road, a network of caravan paths stretching thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and empires. Merchants carried silk, spices, gold, and unknowingly, death. Hidden in the fur of rats and inside tiny fleas was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the microscopic killer responsible for the plague. As traders moved from city to city, the infected fleas traveled with them. Slowly, quietly, the disease spread westward, creeping closer to Europe. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. One of the most chilling moments in this story occurred in 1347 near the Black Sea. At a trading port controlled by Italian merchants, ships began arriving filled with sick and dying sailors. This port was called Kaffa, and according to historical accounts, it became one of the earliest gateways of the plague into Europe. Some reports describe a terrifying siege in which attacking forces allegedly hurled infected corpses over the city walls, spreading disease inside the city itself. Whether entirely true or partly exaggerated, what happened next is undeniable. Merchant ships fleeing the port carried the infection across the Mediterranean. Within months, plague ships reached cities like Messina, Genoa, and Venice. Sailors staggered off the ships covered in black swellings and fever. Many died before even touching land, and that was only the beginning. Once the plague entered Europe, it spread faster than anything people had ever seen. Medieval cities were crowded, dirty, and full of animals. Rats lived everywhere, in homes, markets, and ships. Fleas jumped from rats to humans, carrying the deadly bacteria into the bloodstream. The first symptom was often fever and exhaustion. Then came the most horrifying sign, swollen black lumps known as buboes appearing on the neck, armpits, and groin. Victims suffered unbearable pain as their bodies began to shut down. In many cases, death arrived within just 3 days. Entire households died before help could arrive. Streets that once echoed with merchants and travelers became eerily quiet. Fear spread just as fast as the disease. In medieval Europe, people had no idea what bacteria or infection were. Doctors could not explain why healthy people suddenly collapsed. Some believed the plague came from poisonous air, released by earthquakes or strange planetary alignments. Others believed it was divine punishment. Churches filled with terrified crowds begging for forgiveness, but prayer alone could not stop the epidemic. In desperation, people turned to extreme rituals. One movement known as the flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves in public, believing their suffering would convince God to end the plague. Blood ran down their backs as crowds watched in silence, yet the disease continued to spread. The chaos led to one of the darkest secrets of the plague years, the search for someone to blame. Across Europe, rumors spread that certain groups had poisoned wells or caused the disease through dark magic. In many places, these rumors turned into violence. Jewish communities were falsely accused and brutally attacked. Entire neighborhoods were burned. Families who had lived peacefully in towns for generations were suddenly hunted. Historians now consider these persecutions among the most tragic consequences of the plague. Meanwhile, doctors struggled desperately to treat the sick. Without understanding germs or bacteria, people of medieval Europe resorted to bizarre, desperate, and often ineffective measures to protect themselves from the plague. Physicians recommended bleeding patients to remove bad blood, believing that the disease could be purged from the body. Others burned herbs, carried fragrant flowers, or inhaled aromatic substances to shield themselves from what they imagined was poisoned air. Entire towns performed strange rituals, while the fearful populace tried anything, no matter how illogical, to avoid the invisible killer. Among the most iconic figures of this era was the plague doctor, instantly recognizable by the long bird-like mask. The mask's beak was stuffed with a mixture of herbs, spices, and perfumed substances meant to filter out deadly miasmas. Cloaked in long robes and gloves, these doctors cut an eerie, almost theatrical figure as they moved among the sick. Though their appearance was frightening, it represented one of the earliest attempts at protective medical clothing. In reality, it did little to prevent infection, and even the most cautious physicians often succumbed to the disease. As months stretched into years, the plague left entire regions of Europe in ruin. Farms were abandoned, trade halted, and governments struggled to maintain law and order. Streets became silent, cities emptied, and mass graves were dug to cope with the sheer number of deaths. In cities like Florence and London, eyewitnesses described scenes of unimaginable horror. Neighbors collapsing in the streets, families destroyed, homes deserted, and the stench of decay lingering in alleys and marketplaces. Markets once bustling with life became empty shells. The once lively hum of trade and conversation was replaced with fearful silence. Communities that had thrived for generations disintegrated. Fear spread faster than the disease itself, as surviving citizens avoided even their own loved ones. The human toll was staggering, millions of lives lost, entire towns depopulated, and generations scarred by grief and trauma. The plague reshaped Europe not only demographically, but socially and culturally, leaving behind a world forever altered by its devastating shadow. Despite humanity's desperate attempts, rituals, prayers, strange concoctions, and the eerie protection of the plague doctor, nothing could stop the relentless march of death sweeping across the continent. Parents abandoned sick children. Friends refused to visit the dying. Some believed even touching clothing or breathing nearby air could bring death. Society itself began to break apart. But hidden within this tragedy is another shocking secret. The plague also changed the balance of power in Europe forever. Before the plague, most people in medieval society were peasants working the land for wealthy nobles. Labor was cheap because there were so many workers, but when the plague killed millions, the population collapsed. Suddenly there were not enough workers to farm the fields or build cities. Survivors found themselves in a new position of power. Peasants began demanding better wages and more rights. Landowners who once controlled everything now struggled to keep their estates running. In some regions, this shift helped weaken the rigid feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries. The plague had unintentionally sparked a social revolution. Another dark secret lies in how the disease returned again and again. The Black Death was not a single event, but the beginning of centuries of recurring outbreaks. Even after the first wave ended around 1351, the plague kept returning every few decades. To fight the outbreaks, some cities began experimenting with new strategies. One of the most important innovations was quarantine. The word itself comes from the Italian term meaning 40 days. In the port city of Venice, ships arriving from infected regions were forced to wait outside the harbor for 40 days before passengers could enter the city. Despite the horror, the plague also changed how people saw life itself. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio documented the tragedy in works such as The Decameron, giving future generations a glimpse into the fear and resilience of those who lived through it. Modern science eventually revealed the true cause of the medieval plague, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread primarily by fleas living on rats. Today, antibiotics can treat it, but in the medieval world, it was unstoppable. And its shadow changed history forever.